Power isn't given, power is taken. And in the history of the Sith, no one understood this fundamental truth better than Marka Ragnos. His story begins not with his birth, but with the empire he would inherit, an empire built on the ashes of fallen Jedi and the blood of conquered worlds. To understand Marka Ragnos, we must first understand the galaxy he was born into. Around 500 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Sith Empire stood as a civilization unto itself, hidden from the Republic that had exiled its founders over 1,000 years earlier. This was not the Sith of legend that viewers might know from the tales of Darth Vader or Darth Sidious. This was something older, rawer, more primal in its connection to the dark side. The Sith Empire of this era sprawled across multiple star systems in the Outer Rim, with Korriban serving as its spiritual heart and Ziost as its administrative center. These worlds bore the architectural marks of a culture obsessed with immortality and dominance. Massive ziggurats pierced blood-red skies, their surfaces carved with ancient runes that pulsed with dark side energy. Temple complexes larger than most Republic cities sprawled across desert valleys, each one a monument to a particular Dark Lord's vanity and power. The society itself operated on principles that would seem barbaric to Republic citizens. Slavery was not merely accepted, but considered essential to the Sith way of life. The strong ruled absolutely over the weak, and weakness itself was seen as the ultimate sin. Children were taken from their families at young ages to be trained in the dark side, with those who failed their trials often ending up as servants, or worse. Competition was encouraged at every level of society, from the lowest slave fighting for scraps to the highest Sith Lords scheming for greater power and territory. Yet this brutality had a purpose beyond mere cruelty. The Sith believed that conflict was the crucible through which strength was forged. Every challenge overcome, every rival defeated, every hardship endured made an individual stronger. This philosophy, born from the teachings of the original Dark Jedi who had founded the Empire, permeated every aspect of Sith culture. It was into this world of calculated violence and dark ambition that Marka Ragnos would be born. The Sith species themselves were becoming increasingly rare by this period. The original red-skinned humanoids who had inhabited Korriban when the exiled Dark Jedi arrived were now thoroughly intermixed with human bloodlines. Most of the ruling class were hybrids, carrying genetic traits from both species. Pure-blooded Sith were viewed with a mixture of reverence and pity, honored for their heritage, but often seen as relics of a dying age. The future, most believed, belonged to those who could blend the natural dark side affinity of the Sith species with the raw ambition and cunning of human bloodlines. The Dark Lords, who ruled before Ragnos, had established certain traditions that governed succession and power. When a Dark Lord died, the most powerful Sith Lords would gather to determine the successor, either through political maneuvering or, more commonly, through combat. These succession crises often resulted in brief but intense civil conflicts as various factions backed their chosen candidates. The victor would emerge not just as the strongest warrior, but as the most capable manipulator, the one who could forge alliances when needed and break them just as easily when they became inconvenient. The decades before Ragnos' rise had been particularly tumultuous. Several Dark Lords had held power only briefly before being overthrown or assassinated. This instability threatened the very foundations of the Empire. rival Sith lords carved out independent fiefdoms, paying lip service to whoever claimed the title of Dark Lord while essentially operating as autonomous rulers. The great Sith academies on Korriban competed with each other, each claiming their teachings were the true path to dark side mastery. Slave revolts, while always brutally suppressed, were becoming more frequent as the ruling class became distracted by their internal power struggles. It was into this fractured, violent, ambitious world that Marka Ragnos emerged. His birth itself was significant, though the exact details have been lost to time and the deliberate obfuscation that Sith lords often employed regarding their origins. What we know is that Ragnos was born to a lineage that combined both Sith and human ancestry, making him a hybrid like most of the ruling elite. His father was a Sith lord of considerable power, though not one of the primary contenders for the throne of Dark Lord. His mother's identity remains more mysterious, with some accounts suggesting she was a powerful Sith sorceress in her own right, while others claim she was a member of the pure-blooded Sith nobility. The young Ragnos displayed an affinity for the dark side from an exceptionally early age. Accounts from this period, preserved in Sith holocrons and ancient texts, speak of a child who could manipulate the Force before he could properly speak, who could sense the emotions and intentions of those around him with unsettling accuracy. His parents, recognizing his potential, ensured he received the finest training available within the Sith Empire. He studied under multiple masters, each contributing different aspects to his education in the dark side. From Sith warriors, young Ragnos learned the art of lightsaber combat. The Sith fighting styles of this era were more varied than those that would come later, with different schools emphasizing different approaches. Some focused on raw power and aggression, overwhelming opponents through sheer force. Others taught precision and economy of movement, seeking to end fights with single, perfect strikes. Ragnos studied them all, absorbing techniques from every master who would teach him. He understood early that true mastery came not from adhering to a single style, but from being able to adapt to any opponent and any situation. From Sith sorcerers, he learned the more esoteric applications of the dark side. Sith alchemy, the art of using the Force to reshape living things at a fundamental level, was one of the Empire's most jealously guarded secrets. Ragnos proved a natural at this dark science, creating twisted creatures that served as both guards and symbols of his growing power. He also studied Sith magic, learning to manipulate minds, summon Force lightning, and drain the life essence from his victims. These were not mere parlor tricks, but weapons as deadly as any lightsaber in the right hands. Perhaps most importantly, Ragnos learned politics and manipulation from the masters of Sith court intrigue. The Sith Empire was as much a political entity as a military one, and success required understanding the complex web of alliances, rivalries, debts, and grudges that connected the various Sith lords. Young Ragnos learned to identify the ambitious, the greedy, the fearful, and the proud. He learned which weaknesses could be exploited, which desires could be used as leverage, and which threats were real versus which were merely bluster. As Ragnos matured, he began to distinguish himself from his peers in the Sith academies. While other students focused on mastering single aspects of the dark side, becoming specialized in combat or sorcery or manipulation, Ragnos pursued a more comprehensive approach. He understood that the greatest weakness of most Sith lords was their predictability. A warrior who could only fight was vulnerable to sorcery. A sorcerer who neglected combat training could be overwhelmed by a skilled duelist. A politician who lacked personal power would eventually be challenged by those stronger in the Force. Ragnos determined to have no such weaknesses. He would be formidable in every arena where Sith competed for power. This decision required sacrifices. While his peers had time for leisure, for the decadent pleasures that Sith lords often indulged in, Ragnos devoted nearly every waking hour to training and study. He pushed himself to the edge of exhaustion and beyond, using pain and struggle as tools to forge himself into something greater than what nature had provided. His first true test came when he was still relatively young for a Sith Lord, barely into his 30s. One of his instructors, a powerful Sith warrior named Hakagram Grouch, decided to eliminate Ragnos as a potential future rival. Grouch was ancient and paranoid, seeing threats everywhere, and he had made a career of eliminating promising young Sith before they could threaten his position. He challenged Ragnos to a duel, ostensibly as a final examination of his combat training, but fully intending to kill the young hybrid. The duel took place in one of Korriban's great training amphitheaters, with dozens of other Sith lords and apprentices watching from the stone seats that ringed the combat floor. Grouch was confident, having killed many opponents in similar duels over his long life. He expected to overwhelm the younger Sith with superior experience and strength. What he encountered instead was something that caught him completely off guard. Ragnos didn't fight like other young Sith. He didn't rely on passion and aggression alone, though he had those in abundance. Instead, he fought with a cold calculation that was unusual in one so young. He studied Grouch's movements, identified patterns in his attacks, and waited for the perfect moment to exploit them. When Grouch lunged in what he thought was a killing strike, Ragnos sidestepped with minimal movement, his own lightsaber flashing in a precise arc that severed Grouch's sword arm at the elbow. The ancient Sith Lord fell to his knees, staring in shock at the stump where his arm had been. By the laws of the Sith, the duel was over. Ragnos had won, and Grouch's life was forfeit. But Ragnos didn't immediately deliver the killing blow. Instead, he circled his defeated opponent, speaking loud enough for all the watching Sith to hear. He explained exactly how he had won, pointing out each mistake Grouch had made, each overconfidence that had created an opening. It was a lesson in humiliation as much as combat, demonstrating that Ragnos possessed not just skill, but the analytical mind to understand and articulate his victory. Only then did Ragnos end Grouch's life with a single thrust of his crimson blade. The message to the other Sith was clear. Marka Ragnos was not just another promising apprentice. He was something more dangerous, someone who combined power with intelligence, passion with calculation. In the Sith Empire, reputation was everything, and in that single duel, Ragnos had established himself as a force to be reckoned with. Following his victory over Grouch, Ragnos's ascent through the ranks of Sith society accelerated. He gathered followers, other ambitious Sith who saw in him a rising star they could hitch their fortunes to. He began building his own power base, acquiring territories and resources that would be essential for any bid to claim greater authority. But unlike many young Sith lords who rushed toward power, Ragnos proceeded with patience that seemed almost un-Sith-like in its deliberation. He understood something that many of his peers did not. The Sith Empire rewarded strength and ambition, yes, but it also punished those who reached too far, too fast. A Sith Lord who acquired power faster than they could defend it became a target, attracting the attention of more established rivals who would unite to destroy the upstart before they became a genuine threat. Ragnos had studied enough Sith history to know that many promising careers had ended this way, cut short by ambitious fools who mistook early success for invincibility. So Ragnos built his foundation carefully. When he acquired new territory, he ensured it was defensible and profitable. When he recruited new followers, he tested their loyalty thoroughly before granting them any real authority. When he made alliances with other Sith Lords, he always kept multiple backup plans in case those alliances turned sour. This methodical approach meant his rise was slower than it might have been, but it also meant each step forward was solid and secure. During this period, Ragnos also began to develop the philosophy that would guide his eventual reign as Dark Lord. He observed that most Sith Lords made a fundamental error in how they approached power. They saw it as finite, something to be hoarded jealously and defended against all challengers. This led to constant, exhausting conflict, as every Sith Lord saw every other as a threat to their position. The Empire's energy was directed inward, with Sith fighting Sith rather than expanding their collective power. Ragnos conceived of a different approach. Power, he theorized, was not finite, but could grow through proper management. A strong empire with clear hierarchy and intelligent direction could expand, conquering new worlds and bringing their resources and populations under Sith control. This would create new opportunities for ambitious Sith to distinguish themselves and acquire power without necessarily threatening those already established. The key was having a Dark Lord strong enough to maintain order and intelligent enough to channel Sith ambition toward productive rather than destructive ends. This philosophy was revolutionary for the Sith, though Ragnos was careful about who he shared it with. Most Sith Lords would see such ideas as weakness, a dilution of the pure principle that strength must dominate weakness. But a select few, those who had the wit to see beyond immediate gratification to long-term benefit, understood what Ragnos was proposing. These Sith became his closest allies, knowing that under a ruler with such vision, there would be opportunities for them to thrive. As decades passed, Ragnos continued to accumulate power and influence. He proved himself in numerous conflicts, both against external threats and internal rivals. His mastery of the dark side grew deeper, and his understanding of Sith politics became more sophisticated. He learned when to be merciful and when to be ruthless, when to negotiate and when to attack. Every experience, every success and failure was analyzed and incorporated into his growing strategic wisdom. By the time he reached his prime, Marka Ragnos had become one of the most powerful Sith Lords in the Empire. His domains were vast and well administered. His warriors were disciplined and loyal. His treasury was full. His reputation was formidable. Yet, he had not yet made a bid for the throne of Dark Lord. He waited, watched, and continued to build his strength. Because Ragnos understood that claiming the throne was only the beginning. The real challenge was keeping it. The opportunity finally came during a period of particular instability. The reigning Dark Lord, whose name has been largely forgotten by history compared to Ragnos's enduring fame, was growing old and weak. His ability to maintain order was faltering, and the Empire was beginning to fracture as various Sith Lords sensed vulnerability. Minor conflicts were breaking out across Sith space, each one a test to see if the Dark Lord would or could respond. When the responses came, they were slow and ineffective, confirming to observers that the current ruler's time was ending. Several powerful Sith Lords began positioning themselves for the succession that they knew was coming. These were formidable individuals in their own right, each commanding significant resources and having proven themselves in combat and intrigue. They began forming blocks of supporters, making promises and threats as they jockeyed for position. The Empire seemed poised on the brink of civil war, with different factions ready to tear it apart in their struggle for supremacy. Ragnos watched this developing chaos with the patience of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He didn't rush to declare himself a candidate or begin making alliances with the various factions. Instead, he observed, analyzed, and waited. He identified which Sith Lords were genuine contenders and which were merely opportunists hoping to gain concessions from the eventual winner. He assessed the strengths and weaknesses of each faction, noting which had real military power and which were built more on reputation than reality. When the Dark Lord finally died, the succession crisis erupted exactly as predicted. Multiple Sith Lords declared themselves candidates, and their supporters began mobilizing for war. The Empire seemed doomed to tear itself apart in fratricidal conflict. But before large-scale fighting could truly begin, Marka Ragnos made his move, and it was unlike anything the other contenders had anticipated. Rather than joining the conflict militarily, Ragnos presented himself as the solution to it. He sent representatives to all the major factions, proposing a grand council where the succession would be decided not through war, but through a demonstration of power and a vote among the most influential Sith Lords. The proposal was brilliant in its timing and its appeal to different interests. Those Sith Lords who were confident in their power saw it as a chance to prove themselves without the risks and costs of warfare. Those who were less certain saw it as a way to avoid being crushed in a conflict they might not survive. The council convened on Korriban in the Great Hall of the Primary Sith Academy. Dozens of Sith Lords gathered, each with their retinues of warriors and apprentices. The atmosphere was tense, charged with dark side energy and barely suppressed aggression. Multiple duels broke out during the first day as old grudges and new insults led to violence. But Ragnos had anticipated this and had positioned his own forces strategically throughout the hall and the surrounding area. When fights threatened to escalate into broader conflicts, his warriors intervened, not to defend any particular side, but to enforce order and allow the proceedings to continue. Over the course of several days, the various candidates for Dark Lord presented their cases. Some demonstrated their combat prowess through elaborate duels against champions they had brought for this purpose. Others displayed their mastery of Sith sorcery, creating illusions and summoning dark side phenomena that awed the assembled lords. Still others spoke of their accomplishments, the territories they controlled, the victories they had won, the resources they commanded. When Ragnos's turn came, he did something unexpected. Rather than focusing on his own power, though it was considerable, he spoke of the Empire. He painted a picture of what the Sith could become if they directed their energy outward rather than inward. He described expansion into new territories, conquest of wealthy worlds, the accumulation of power on a scale that would dwarf their current holdings. He acknowledged the Sith need for conflict and competition, but proposed channeling it toward building something greater, rather than tearing down what already existed. More importantly, he made specific promises to the various Sith Lords present. To the warriors, he promised campaigns of conquest, where they could prove their strength and win glory. To the sorcerers, he promised support for their research and access to artifacts and knowledge from the worlds they would conquer. To the administrators, he promised new territories to govern and the resources to do so effectively. To all of them, he offered a vision where ambition could be satisfied through expansion rather than exclusively through internal conflict. It was a masterful performance, combining inspiration with concrete benefits, appealing to both idealism and self-interest. But Ragnos knew that words alone would not be sufficient. When one of the other major candidates, a massive Sith Lord named Garn Tarsher, challenged him to single combat to prove his worthiness, Ragnos accepted immediately. The duel that followed would become legendary in Sith history. Tarsher was a giant of a warrior, standing nearly 7 feet tall and built like a siege engine. He had won his reputation through dozens of duels and was known for his overwhelming physical power. His strategy was simple and effective: close with opponents quickly, use his strength advantage to overpower their defenses, and end fights through sheer force. He had killed opponents half his size without breaking a sweat. Against Ragnos, who was of more average build, he expected an easy victory. The duel began in the traditional Sith manner, with both combatants igniting their lightsabers and beginning to circle each other, looking for openings. Tarsher struck first, a massive overhand blow that would have crushed most defenses. Ragnos didn't try to block it directly. Instead, he sidestepped and redirected the energy of the strike, using Tarsher's own momentum against him. The larger Sith stumbled slightly, surprised by the technique. What followed was a masterclass in adaptive combat. Ragnos didn't fight Tarsher's fight. He didn't try to match strength with strength, which would have played to his opponent's advantages. Instead, he turned the duel into a game of precision versus power, speed versus strength, intelligence versus aggression. He struck at joints and tendons, at spots where armor was weakest, at targets that would accumulate damage over time rather than seeking a single killing blow. Tarsher grew increasingly frustrated as his attacks failed to connect or returned aside with minimal effort. He began to make mistakes, overcommitting to strikes, leaving himself exposed as he tried to land a decisive blow. Ragnos capitalized on each error, inflicting small wounds that individually might not have been severe, but cumulatively began to take their toll. The giant Sith was bleeding from a dozen cuts, his movements becoming slower and less coordinated. The end came when Tarsher, desperate and enraged, abandoned all technique and simply charged at Ragnos with his lightsaber extended, counting on his mass and strength to overwhelm his smaller opponent. Ragnos waited until the last possible moment, then dropped beneath the charge, his own lightsaber cutting upward in a precise strike that severed Tarsher's leg at the knee. The massive Sith crashed to the ground, his charge turned into an uncontrolled tumble. Ragnos rose and stood over his defeated opponent. The assembled Sith Lords waited to see what he would do. By rights, Tarsher's life was his to take, but Ragnos made a calculated decision. He offered Tarsher the choice: serve him as Dark Lord or die. The large Sith, seeing in Ragnos's eyes both the power to kill him and the wisdom to offer an alternative, chose service. With Sith medical technology, his leg could be replaced with a cybernetic that might even make him stronger. And serving a Dark Lord who had defeated him in honest combat held no shame in Sith culture. This moment proved decisive. One of the other major candidates for the throne had just publicly acknowledged Ragnos' superiority and pledged himself as a servant. Other Sith lords began to reassess their positions. Over the following days, more and more of them declared their support for Ragnos. Some did so because they genuinely believed in his vision. Others because they calculated he was likely to win and wanted to be on the winning side. Still others because they feared what might happen if they opposed him. By the time the council concluded, Marka Ragnos had secured enough support to claim the throne of Dark Lord of the Sith with minimal opposition. The few who continued to resist found themselves isolated and outnumbered. Most of them wisely bent the knee. A handful who refused were dealt with efficiently, their territories absorbed into those of loyal supporters, and their names struck from Sith records. Thus, around 500 years before the Battle of Yavin, Marka Ragnos became the Dark Lord of the Sith Empire. He was crowned in a ceremony of tremendous dark side power on Korriban, with thousands of Sith and subjects in attendance. The ritual was designed to be both awe-inspiring and terrifying, demonstrating that the Sith Empire now had a leader who combined power with vision, strength with intelligence. As Ragnos sat upon the throne, accepting the obeisance of the assembled Sith lords, he must have reflected on the long journey that had brought him to this moment. From his birth into the fractured, violent world of the Sith Empire, through years of training and struggle, through decades of careful maneuvering and patient accumulation of power, he had finally claimed the ultimate prize. He was now the absolute ruler of one of the most powerful dark side civilizations in galactic history. But Ragnos knew that claiming the throne was only the beginning of the real challenge. Many Sith before him had won power only to lose it quickly through poor leadership or betrayal. The average reign of a Dark Lord in the centuries before Ragnos had been measured in years, not decades. The Sith respected strength, but were also constantly testing for weakness, always looking for opportunities to advance their own interests. A Dark Lord who showed vulnerability, who made significant mistakes, who failed to deliver on the promises that had brought them to power, would not last long. Marka Ragnos was determined to be different. He had not fought his way to the throne just to become another footnote in Sith history. He had plans, grand visions for what the Empire could become under proper leadership, and he had the intelligence, power, and ruthlessness to make those plans reality. The golden age of the Sith was about to begin, and it would be unlike anything the Empire had seen before. As the coronation ceremony concluded and the assembled Sith dispersed to their various domains, whispers spread throughout the Empire. A new Dark Lord had risen, one who combined power and intelligence in ways rarely seen. Some whispered with hope, believing Ragnos might bring stability and prosperity. Others whispered with fear, uncertain what this new ruler might demand of them. All wondered how long this Dark Lord would last, how his reign would compare to those who had come before. They would not have long to wait for answers. Marka Ragnos was about to demonstrate exactly what kind of ruler he would be, and his methods would reshape the Sith Empire for generations to come. The stage was set for what historians would call the Golden Age of the Sith, a period of unprecedented power and prosperity that would last for over a century. And at its center stood one Sith Lord who had mastered the art of maintaining power in a culture built on ambition and conflict. The rise of Marka Ragnos to the throne of Dark Lord was complete. Now would come the true test, ruling the Sith Empire and maintaining power in the most dangerous, ambitious, cutthroat civilization the galaxy had ever known. Power claimed is not the same as power kept. The throne of Dark Lord sat upon a foundation of ambition and betrayal, and more than one ruler before Marka Ragnos had learned this truth too late. But Ragnos was different. He understood that ruling the Sith required more than strength alone. It required vision, manipulation, and an almost supernatural ability to stay ahead of those who would see him fall. The first year of Ragnos's reign would prove decisive in establishing the tone for everything that followed. He began by making good on the promises he had made during his rise to power, but in ways that also reinforced his authority and created dependency on his continued rule. To the warrior class, he granted campaigns of conquest, but these were carefully planned expeditions against specific targets rather than chaotic raids. He personally selected the commanders and ensured that victories would bring glory to participants, while also expanding the Empire's strategic reach. The first major conquest under Ragnos's reign was the Chahodos system, a cluster of mineral-rich worlds that had resisted previous Sith attempts at subjugation. The natives were fierce and had developed impressive defensive technologies that made direct assault costly. Previous Dark Lords had attempted to conquer these worlds through brute force, losing significant numbers of warriors in the process and ultimately withdrawing in failure. These defeats had been embarrassing, suggesting weakness in the Sith military that emboldened other potential enemies. Ragnos approached the problem differently. Rather than simply sending more warriors to throw themselves at Chahodos' defenses, he studied the situation thoroughly. He had scouts infiltrate the system covertly, gathering intelligence on military capabilities, political divisions, and economic vulnerabilities. What they discovered was that the Chahodos Confederation was not as unified as it appeared. Several member worlds resented the dominant planet's control and felt their concerns were being ignored in favor of the central government's interests. Ragnos exploited these divisions masterfully. He made secret contact with the disaffected worlds, offering them autonomy and favorable trade terms if they would accept Sith rule instead of Chahodos' dominance. Simultaneously, he imposed an economic blockade that strangled the system's commerce without firing a shot. When the Chahodos finally moved to break the blockade militarily, the Sith fleet was ready and inflicted a crushing defeat in open space battle. The worlds that had made agreements with Ragnos turned on their former confederates, and what had seemed like an impregnable system fell with minimal Sith casualties. This victory accomplished multiple objectives for Ragnos. First, it demonstrated his military competence and strategic brilliance, qualities essential for maintaining respect among the warrior-dominated Sith culture. Second, it expanded the Empire's resource base significantly, providing wealth that could be distributed to loyal supporters and funding further expansion. Third, it established a template for conquest that emphasized intelligence and manipulation alongside military strength, showing that Ragnos valued brains as well as brawn. To the Sith, sorcerers, and alchemists, Ragnos granted access to resources that previous Dark Lords had kept for themselves. Ancient texts and artifacts that had been locked away in the Dark Lord's personal vaults were made available to qualified scholars, though under strict supervision. He established new research facilities on several worlds, each focused on different aspects of dark side knowledge. Korriban maintained its focus on combat applications and traditional Sith teachings. Ziost became a center for Sith alchemy and genetic manipulation. A newly conquered world called Relg was designated for the study of ancient artifacts and archaeological expeditions to uncover lost knowledge. This distribution of resources served Ragnos' interests in several ways. By granting access to knowledge and facilities, he earned the loyalty of the sorcerer class, who had often felt marginalized by more militaristic Dark Lords. But by maintaining oversight and control of these facilities, he ensured that no single sorcerer could accumulate enough knowledge or power to threaten his position. The researchers were dependent on his continued patronage, and any who showed signs of becoming too powerful or too independent could be quietly eliminated or reassigned to less sensitive projects. To the administrator class, those Sith Lords who governed territories and managed the Empire's day-to-day functions, Ragnos offered the opportunity to excel in ways that had been impossible under previous rulers. He restructured the Empire's bureaucracy to reward efficiency and results rather than merely political connections. Governors who increased their territory's productivity, maintained order, and contributed to the Empire's treasury were granted additional authority and resources. Those who failed to meet expectations found themselves replaced by more capable subordinates. This meritocratic approach, unusual in Sith culture which often prioritized raw power over competence, created a new dynamic in the Empire. Suddenly, administrative skill became a path to advancement, and capable managers who might have been overlooked in favor of more powerful but less effective rivals found opportunities to rise. This expanded the pool of talent serving the Empire and created another constituency of Sith Lords who owed their positions to Ragnos' patronage. But perhaps Ragnos' greatest innovation in consolidating power was his approach to potential rivals. Previous Dark Lords had typically dealt with ambitious subordinates through execution or exile, removing threats, but also eliminating potentially useful servants. Ragnos took a more sophisticated approach. He identified the most ambitious and capable Sith Lords in the Empire, those who might otherwise have been his greatest threats, and gave them tasks that were simultaneously important and impossible to leverage into direct challenges to his authority. For example, a powerful Sith Lord named Sorzus Sin had been one of the candidates for the throne and continued to command significant loyalty among the warrior class. Rather than see her as a threat to be eliminated, Ragnos appointed her as Grand Admiral of the Sith Fleet. This position gave her enormous responsibility and opportunity for glory, satisfying her ambition, but also placed her constantly away from Korriban on military campaigns. She could not easily build a political base to challenge him when she was always on the frontier conquering new worlds. Her victories enhanced the Empire's power and, by extension, Ragnos' prestige, while her absence from the capital prevented her from organizing any conspiracy against him. Another potential rival, a brilliant Sith sorcerer named Horak Mul, was made the chief archaeologist of the Empire and given the mission of exploring ancient sites throughout Sith space. This task appealed to Horak Mul's scholarly nature and kept him occupied with research that benefited the Empire, while also keeping him isolated on remote worlds, far from the centers of political power. When Horak Mul made significant discoveries, as he often did, Ragnos ensured that credit was publicly shared between the discoverer and the Dark Lord who had sponsored the expedition. Through such careful management of his potential rivals, Ragnos created a situation where the most capable and ambitious Sith Lords in the Empire found that their best interest lay in serving him rather than opposing him. They had opportunities for glory, resources to pursue their interests, and the security of knowing that as long as they served competently and loyally, they would be rewarded rather than eliminated. This was a radical departure from typical Sith governance, where paranoia led Dark Lords to preemptively destroy anyone who might pose a threat, regardless of how useful they might be. Yet Ragnos was not naive about Sith nature. He understood that no matter how well he managed his subordinates, some would still seek to overthrow him. For those cases, he maintained an extensive intelligence network that monitored the activities of all significant Sith Lords throughout the Empire. Spies and informants were planted in every major household, every academy, every military unit. Information flowed constantly back to Ragnos, keeping him aware of developing plots before they could mature into serious threats. When conspiracies were discovered, Ragnos's responses were calibrated to maximize their effect. Minor plots, those organized by ambitious but not particularly powerful or competent Sith, were often allowed to develop until the plotters committed themselves fully. Then they would be exposed publicly, arrested, and executed in ways that served as warnings to others. These examples demonstrated that betrayal would not be tolerated and that Ragnos's intelligence network was everywhere. More serious threats, plots organized by powerful Sith Lords with significant resources, were handled differently. Rather than wait for them to fully develop, Ragnos would often intervene early but subtly. A key supporter of the conspiracy might be offered a better deal to betray his confederates. Evidence might be planted that caused the plotters to suspect each other, turning their conspiracy into infighting. Or the leader might find himself suddenly assigned to a distant post, separating him from his power base before he could act. These quiet eliminations of threats were perhaps more effective than public executions because they created uncertainty. Sith Lords never knew if their conspiracies had been detected, if their allies were truly loyal, or if the next assignment from the Dark Lord was reward or subtle punishment. During the first decade of his reign, Ragnos faced at least a dozen serious attempts to overthrow or assassinate him. All failed, and with each failure, his reputation for invincibility grew stronger. Stories spread throughout the Empire of the Dark Lord's seemingly supernatural awareness of threats, his ability to turn his enemies against each other, and the terrible fate that awaited those who opposed him. These stories, whether entirely accurate or embellished in the telling, served a useful purpose. They made potential conspirators think twice before acting, knowing that others before them had failed despite careful planning and significant resources. As the Empire stabilized under Ragnos's rule, the effects of his policies began to show in measurable ways. The economy, which had stagnated under previous Dark Lords due to constant internal conflict, began to grow. New trade routes connected Sith worlds more efficiently. Conquered territories were integrated into the Empire's economic structure, providing raw materials, manufactured goods, and luxury items that enhanced the standard of living even for ordinary citizens. The constant threat of civil war that had hung over the Empire for decades receded as Sith Lords found that serving Ragnos' regime offered better prospects than trying to overthrow it. The Sith military underwent significant reforms during this period. Before Ragnos, the Empire's armed forces had been essentially collections of personal armies belonging to individual Sith Lords. Coordination was poor, logistics were chaotic, and military campaigns often failed due to internal competition and lack of unified command. Ragnos gradually centralized military authority while still allowing individual Sith Lords to maintain their personal forces. A core of professional military units was established, loyal to the Dark Lord rather than to individual nobles. These units served as the backbone of major campaigns and could be deployed to trouble spots without having to negotiate with potentially unreliable Sith Lords. Military technology also advanced during the Golden Age. Sith alchemists worked with engineers to create new weapons and ship designs. Warships became more powerful and more standardized, making maintenance and supply easier. Soldier training became more rigorous and uniform across the Empire. The result was a military machine that was not just larger than before, but significantly more effective per soldier and per ship. This enhanced military capability served multiple purposes for Ragnos. It made external conquests easier and more successful. It deterred potential enemies from testing the Empire's strength, and it provided the force necessary to suppress any internal challenges to his rule. The culture of the Sith Empire evolved during Ragnos' reign as well. While it remained fundamentally built on dark side philosophy and the principle that strength should dominate weakness, there was a new emphasis on channeling that strength productively. Duels and conflicts between Sith Lords didn't cease, but they became more regulated and often served specific purposes rather than being random expressions of aggression. Competitions were organized where Sith could prove their prowess in combat, sorcery, or administration, with winners receiving significant rewards and recognition. These competitions satisfied the Sith need for conflict and testing themselves against rivals, while minimizing the damage such conflicts inflicted on the Empire as a whole. Architecture and art flourished during the Golden Age in ways that reflected Sith values, but also demonstrated the wealth and power of the Empire. New temples were constructed on Korriban that dwarfed those of previous eras, their designs incorporating advanced engineering with dark side aesthetics. These structures served practical purposes as training facilities and centers of Sith power, while also functioning as propaganda, visible demonstrations of the Empire's might. Similar projects on other worlds created a unified Sith architectural style that could be recognized instantly, marking territories as part of the Empire and reminding inhabitants who ruled them. The arts, particularly those forms that served propaganda purposes, received patronage from Ragnos and his loyal Sith Lords. Sculptors created massive statues celebrating Sith victories and honoring powerful Dark Lords, both living and dead. Painters depicted scenes from Sith history and mythology, emphasizing themes of power, dominance, and the superiority of the dark side. Writers composed epics celebrating Sith heroes and the greatness of the Empire. All of this artistic production served to reinforce the legitimacy of the regime and create a shared cultural identity among the diverse species and worlds that made up the Sith Empire. Education within the Empire was systematized during this period. While the Sith academies on Korriban remained the most prestigious institutions for training Force-sensitive individuals in the dark side, new academies were established on other worlds to handle the growing number of students. The curriculum was standardized to ensure all Sith received similar basic training, while still allowing for specialization based on individual aptitudes. Non-Force-sensitive members of the ruling class also received formal education in administration, military command, engineering, and other practical skills necessary for running a galactic empire. This focus on education served several purposes for Ragnos. It created a more capable administrative and military class, improving the Empire's functionality. It helped identify talented individuals early, allowing them to be guided into positions where they could best serve the Empire. And it indoctrinated young Sith in the values and priorities of the regime, creating loyalty that began in childhood and persisted throughout their careers. Students who graduated from these academies understood that their opportunities and success were tied to the stability and prosperity of Ragnos' empire. The population of the Sith Empire grew significantly during the Golden Age. Conquered worlds added billions of subjects, while improved economic conditions on existing Sith worlds led to population increases. The distinction between the Sith species and humans continued to blur as interbreeding became even more common. By the middle of Ragnos' reign, pure-blooded members of the original Sith species were becoming increasingly rare, honored as repositories of ancient bloodlines, but no longer as politically dominant as they had once been. The ruling class was now thoroughly mixed, with individuals of all appearances rising to power based on their strength in the Force and their capability, rather than their genetic purity. This demographic shift, which might have caused tension or conflict under other rulers, was managed smoothly by Ragnos. He publicly honored the Sith species' heritage while making clear that power and position would be determined by ability rather than ancestry. This balanced approach satisfied traditionalists who valued the old bloodlines while also opening opportunities for talented individuals regardless of their background. It was another example of Ragnos' skill at managing competing interests within the Empire, finding ways to accommodate different factions without compromising his own authority. As decades passed and Ragnos' reign continued, something remarkable happened. The Empire began to experience something it had rarely known: genuine stability and prosperity. Internal conflicts, while never completely eliminated given Sith nature, decreased significantly. The economy expanded continuously, bringing wealth not just to the nobility, but increasingly to lower levels of society as well. Military campaigns brought victory after victory, expanding the Empire's borders and influence. Cultural achievements proliferated, creating a rich artistic and intellectual life that complemented the Empire's military and economic power. Historians studying this period from the distance of millennia would struggle to explain how Ragnos maintained power for so long in a culture built on constant competition and the overthrow of weak leaders. The answer lay in his multifaceted approach to rule. He was strong enough in the Force and in combat to defend himself against direct challenges. He was intelligent enough to outmaneuver those who tried to use politics and intrigue against him. He was visionary enough to give ambitious Sith Lords opportunities that satisfied their cravings for power without threatening his own position. And he was ruthless enough to eliminate those threats that could not be managed through other means. But perhaps most importantly, Ragnos understood that maintaining power was not about preventing all challenges, but about ensuring that the cost of challenging him was always higher than the potential benefit. A Sith Lord contemplating rebellion had to consider not just whether he could win in combat or intrigue against Ragnos, but whether success would be worth it. Would he be better off as the ruler of a fractured, war-torn empire than as a highly ranked and well-rewarded subordinate in a prosperous and expanding one? For most, the answer was no, and so they served rather than rebelled. This calculation became more favorable to Ragnos as his reign lengthened. Each year that passed without his overthrow added to his reputation for invincibility. Each successful campaign, each prosperity milestone, each cultural achievement reinforced the perception that the Empire was better off with him in power. Younger Sith who came of age during his reign knew nothing but stability and prosperity under his rule, making them less inclined to risk that stability through rebellion. Even those who remembered the chaos before Ragnos found that their memories of those times made them reluctant to return to such conditions. The middle period of Ragnos's reign, roughly from year 30 to year 70 of his rule, represented the absolute peak of the Golden Age. The Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, spanning numerous star systems and incorporating billions of subjects. The military was at its most formidable, having perfected techniques and technologies through decades of successful campaigns. The economy was so prosperous that even ordinary citizens enjoyed standards of living that would have seemed luxurious in earlier eras. The arts and culture flourished as never before, with Sith philosophy and aesthetics reaching levels of sophistication unknown in previous periods. During this peak period, Ragnos himself became something more than merely a powerful ruler. He transcended into the realm of legend even during his own lifetime. Stories circulated throughout the empire of his wisdom, his power, his supernatural ability to anticipate threats and opportunities. These stories were partly true, partly exaggeration, and partly deliberate propaganda, but their effect was profound. Ragnos became not just the Dark Lord, but the embodiment of Sith ideals, the living proof that strength, intelligence, and ruthlessness combined could achieve greatness. Young Sith were taught to emulate him, to study his tactics, to internalize his approach to power. Religious and quasi-religious movements began to form around Ragnos's figure. Some Sith began to venerate him as more than merely powerful, suggesting he had achieved a state of being that transcended normal limitations. While Ragnos never explicitly encouraged such beliefs, neither did he discourage them, recognizing their utility in maintaining his authority. If some Sith believed he was touched by destiny or had achieved supernatural awareness, they were less likely to challenge him and more likely to obey his commands without question. Foreign powers beyond the Sith Empire's borders became increasingly wary of this resurgent civilization. Worlds and minor empires that had previously thought themselves safe due to distance now found themselves in the path of Sith expansion. Some attempted to form alliances against the Sith, but these efforts were usually unsuccessful. Ragnos's intelligence network identified such attempts early, and diplomatic or military interventions prevented coalitions from forming. Other foreign powers attempted to open negotiations, seeking trade agreements or non-aggression pacts that might buy them safety. Ragnos entertained such overtures when they served his purposes. Signing treaties he had no intention of honoring long-term, but which bought time for the empire to strengthen its position before eventually conquering the would-be negotiating partners. The few foreign powers that did attempt military action against the Sith during this period invariably regretted it. The Empire's military had become so formidable that challenges were met with overwhelming force. Ragnos made examples of those who attacked the Empire, not just defeating them, but utterly destroying their capacity for future resistance. Entire civilizations that raised arms against the Sith found themselves conquered completely, their populations enslaved, their worlds stripped of resources, and their histories rewritten to serve as warnings to others. These brutal responses served both as deterrents and as demonstrations of the Sith Empire's power, discouraging further challenges while also satisfying the Sith appetite for conquest and domination. As Ragnos aged, which he did remarkably slowly due to his mastery of dark side techniques that extended life beyond normal spans, he began to consider questions of legacy and succession. Unlike many Dark Lords who refused to think about their mortality, Ragnos was pragmatic enough to recognize that even his reign would eventually end. The question was, what would happen to the empire he had built after his death? Would it continue to prosper and expand, or would it tear itself apart in civil war, as had happened so often before? This concern led Ragnos to begin grooming potential successors among the younger generation of Sith Lords. He didn't choose a single heir, which would have made that individual a target for rivals and potentially emboldened them to try accelerating the succession through assassination. Instead, he elevated several promising young Sith to positions of authority and responsibility, creating a pool of candidates who could compete for the throne after his death. This approach had the benefit of ensuring that his successor would be tested through competition, emerging from the process as the strongest and most capable candidate. Among these potential successors were several individuals who would later become significant figures in Sith history. A young Sith Lord named Naga Sadow showed particular promise, combining military skill with strategic thinking and ambition. Another candidate, Ludo Kresh, was more conservative and traditionalist, but demonstrated exceptional administrative capability and a deep understanding of Sith culture. Ragnos observed them all, sometimes subtly manipulating their rivalries to test their abilities, always assessing who might be capable of maintaining his empire after his death. The final decades of Ragnos's reign saw him increasingly focused on securing his legacy. He commissioned extensive histories of his rule, ensuring that his achievements would be remembered accurately by future generations. He oversaw the construction of an elaborate tomb on Korriban, a monument that would stand as a testament to his power and importance. This tomb was not merely a burial chamber, but a complex designed to preserve his body and possibly his spirit through dark side rituals, allowing him to influence future events even after death. Ragnos also became more involved in the spiritual and philosophical aspects of Sith teachings. He spent more time studying ancient texts and conducting experiments with the Force that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Some of these experiments involved attempts to preserve his consciousness beyond death, to achieve a form of immortality that would allow him to guide or influence the Empire even from beyond the grave. While the full extent of his success in these endeavors would only become clear after his death, there were indications that he was achieving breakthroughs that previous Sith Lords had only dreamed of. Despite his advancing age and his focus on legacy, Ragnos never relaxed his grip on power. He remained the absolute ruler of the Empire, still capable of defeating challenges through combat, intrigue, or overwhelming force as circumstances required. Those who mistook his age for weakness learned their error quickly and fatally. The intelligence network that had served him so well throughout his reign continued to operate at peak efficiency, keeping him informed of all significant developments throughout the Empire and beyond. The prosperity and expansion that characterized the Golden Age continued even in the final years of Ragnos' life. New worlds fell to Sith conquest. The economy continued to grow. Cultural achievements proliferated. To the citizens of the Empire, it seemed as though the good times would last forever, that Ragnos had discovered the secret to eternal rule, and that the Empire would never again experience the chaos and instability of previous eras. Even among the Sith Lords, many of whom had spent their entire adult lives under Ragnos' rule, there was a sense that he was simply too powerful, too intelligent, too successful to ever be overthrown or to die. But Ragnos himself knew better. He understood that no matter how powerful he had become, mortality remained the ultimate enemy, one that could not be defeated through combat or manipulated through intrigue. The dark side could extend life, but it could not grant true immortality, at least not in the straightforward sense. Death would come eventually, and when it did, everything he had built would face its greatest test. Would the Empire survive his passing? Would his successors maintain what he had created, or would ambition and short-sightedness lead them to tear it apart? These questions preoccupied Ragnos' thoughts increasingly as his reign entered its final phase. He had built something unprecedented in Sith history, an empire that had known over a century of stability and prosperity. He had proven that Sith nature, properly channeled and directed, could create civilization rather than merely destroying it. He had shown that darkness, when wielded with intelligence and vision, could build as well as tear down. But could these achievements survive without him? Or was his personal power and wisdom the only thing holding the structure together, destined to collapse once the cornerstone was removed? The answer to these questions would become clear soon enough. For as Ragnos approached the end of his extraordinary life, events were being set in motion that would test everything he had built. His death would trigger exactly the succession crisis he had spent years trying to prevent, and the choices made by his would-be successors would determine whether the golden age he had created would continue or collapse into another dark age for the Sith. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of the Empire and ultimately lead to its fall. But before that dark future could arrive, there were still years of glory, prosperity, and power to enjoy. All empires fall, all reigns end. Even the mightiest rulers must eventually face the one enemy that cannot be defeated through strength or cunning. For Marka Ragnos, that moment came after over a century of absolute rule, after transforming the Sith Empire from a fractured collection of warring territories into a unified galactic power. Death came not through assassination or rebellion, but through the simple passage of time, catching up even to one who had extended his life far beyond normal limits through mastery of the dark side. The exact circumstances of Ragnos' death remain somewhat mysterious, obscured by time and the deliberate mythologizing that began immediately after his passing. What is known is that he died around 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, bringing an end to what historians universally acknowledge as the greatest period in Sith history. His death was not unexpected. In the final years of his life, Ragnos had been increasingly focused on spiritual matters and the construction of his tomb, clear signs that he knew his time was limited and was preparing for the transition. Some accounts suggest that Ragnos chose the moment of his death deliberately, using dark side techniques to preserve his consciousness in ways that would allow him to influence events even after his body failed. Other versions claim that he was conducting a dangerous ritual designed to achieve true immortality when something went wrong, killing him, but perhaps succeeding partially in preserving his spirit. Still other stories, probably less reliable, speak of a final battle against a challenger, a duel that Ragnos won but which left him mortally wounded, choosing to die in his tomb rather than show weakness before the Empire. Whatever the truth of his final moments, the fact of his death could not be hidden. When word spread throughout the Empire that the Dark Lord had passed, the reaction was immediate and profound. For most Sith alive at that moment, Ragnos had been the only Dark Lord they had ever known. His reign had lasted longer than most Sith lived. The idea of the Empire without him seemed almost incomprehensible. It was as if a fundamental constant of the universe had changed, leaving everyone uncertain about what would happen next. The funeral arrangements reflected both Sith tradition and Ragnos's unique status. His body was prepared through ancient rituals involving Sith alchemy and dark side techniques designed to preserve it indefinitely. These processes were not merely for show, but served specific purposes in Ragnos's plans for maintaining influence beyond death. The preserved body would serve as an anchor for his spirit, a physical connection to the material world that would allow his consciousness to manifest and interact with the living in ways that would not otherwise be possible. His tomb had been under construction for years, a massive structure on Korriban that dwarfed the burial monuments of previous Dark Lords. Built into the Valley of the Dark Lords, the traditional resting place for Sith rulers, Ragnos's tomb was designed to be both a monument to his greatness and a functional facility for dark-side rituals. Its chambers were carved with runes and symbols of power, its walls lined with precious metals and stones chosen for their ability to channel Force energy. Within the deepest chamber, a sarcophagus of Sith stone waited to receive the body of the greatest Dark Lord the Empire had known. The funeral itself was a massive state ceremony that brought together Sith Lords from across the Empire. Thousands gathered on Korriban to witness the entombment of Ragnos and, more importantly, to position themselves for the succession struggle that everyone knew was coming. The most powerful Sith Lords brought their personal armies and fleets, ostensibly as honor guards, but actually as preparation for the conflict to come. The atmosphere was heavy with dark side energy and political tension, a combination that made even routine interactions charged with potential violence. Among those who gathered were the two Sith Lords who had emerged as the primary contenders to succeed Ragnos. Naga Sadow, whom Ragnos had mentored and elevated, represented the forward-looking faction within the Empire. He believed the Sith should expand aggressively, conquering new territories and potentially even returning to challenge the Republic from which the original Dark Jedi had been exiled. Sadow was charismatic and ambitious, with a talent for Sith sorcery and a vision of the Empire's future that appealed to younger, more aggressive Sith Lords who had grown restless during the long peace of Ragnos' later reign. Opposing Sado was Ludo Kresh, a more conservative figure who advocated for consolidating the Empire's existing power rather than risking it through aggressive expansion. Kresh was concerned that overextension would leave the Empire vulnerable, that conquering too much territory too quickly would strain their ability to hold and govern it. He represented the older, more established Sith Lords, who had prospered under Ragnos' stable rule and feared that change might threaten their positions. Kresh was also powerful in his own right, a formidable warrior and a skilled administrator who understood the complexities of governing the Empire. The funeral ceremony proceeded according to ancient tradition. Ragnos' body, preserved and adorned in the full regalia of the Dark Lord, was carried through the streets of Korriban's capital by the Empire's most powerful warriors. Crowds lined the route, witnessing the passing of an era. When the procession reached the Valley of the Dark Lords, the assembled Sith Lords followed the body into the tomb complex. There, in the central chamber, Ragnos would be laid to rest with all the honors due to his position and achievements. But before the final sealing of the tomb could occur, the political tension that had been building erupted. Naga Sado and Ludo Kresh, both present with their supporters, began to exchange words about the succession. What started as verbal sparring quickly escalated. Accusations flew about who was more worthy to lead the Empire, who better understood Ragnos' vision, who had the strength and wisdom to guide the Sith into the future. Other Sith Lords began taking sides, the chamber splitting into factions as the debate became more heated. Then Sado and Kresh both ignited their lightsabers, their argument transforming into a direct challenge. The two most powerful contenders for the throne of Dark Lord were about to duel right there in Ragnos' tomb, with his body not yet even sealed in its sarcophagus. Their supporters moved to back them up, and what had been a funeral was on the verge of becoming a battle that would desecrate the tomb and potentially trigger the civil war everyone feared. What happened next has become one of the most famous incidents in Sith history. According to multiple eyewitness accounts recorded in various sources, as Sado and Kresh prepared to strike at each other, a figure appeared between them. It was Marka Ragnos, or rather his spirit, manifesting as a ghostly apparition that glowed with dark side energy. The assembled Sith Lords fell silent, shocked by this supernatural appearance. The dead Dark Lord had returned, if only momentarily, to intervene in the crisis his death had created. The spirit of Ragnos spoke, his voice echoing through the tomb with an authority that had not diminished with death. He warned the assembled Sith that their actions threatened to destroy everything the Empire had built. He acknowledged that they were ambitious, that they hungered for power, but cautioned that their ambitions must serve the Empire rather than tearing it apart. He spoke of the future, suggesting that both great triumph and terrible disaster lay ahead for the Sith depending on the choices they made in the coming days and years. Most significantly, Ragnos declined to name a successor. Some accounts suggest he gestured toward both Sado and Kresh, implying that time would reveal which was more worthy. Other versions claim he indicated that the succession should be determined through traditional means, meaning conflict and competition rather than his posthumous decree. His final words, according to most sources, were a warning that the Empire's greatest enemies might not be external threats, but rather the Sith themselves if they allowed ambition to override wisdom. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the spirit vanished. The assembled Sith lords were left stunned, uncertain what to make of what they had witnessed. The immediate crisis was diffused. Sado and Kresh, whatever their ambitions, were not willing to defy a direct intervention by Ragnos' spirit. They deactivated their lightsabers and withdrew with their supporters. But the fundamental conflict remained unresolved. The succession crisis that would eventually doom the Empire had merely been delayed, not prevented. The funeral concluded with Ragnos' body being sealed within his sarcophagus, and the tomb's inner chambers closed according to traditional rituals. Dark side barriers were erected to prevent unauthorized entry, though they were calibrated to allow Ragnos' spirit to pass through should it wish to interact with the outside world. The assembled Sith dispersed, returning to their territories to prepare for the power struggle they all knew was coming. In the days and weeks following the funeral, the Sith Empire began to fracture in exactly the way Ragnos had feared and warned against. Sado and Kresh continued their rivalry, each gathering more supporters and making increasingly bold claims about their right to rule. Other ambitious Sith lords saw opportunity in the chaos and began making their own bids for power, or at least for greater autonomy, from whoever eventually claimed the throne. The unity that Ragnos had carefully maintained for over a century began to dissolve as various factions pursued their own interests. The situation escalated rapidly. Within months of Ragnos' death, the Empire was on the brink of civil war. Sado, ever the aggressive tactician, made a bold move that would change everything. When the Republic discovered the Sith Empire through the accidental arrival of the Darrigan siblings, Sado saw opportunity where others saw threat. He manipulated events to make it appear that the Republic was preparing for war, using this manufactured crisis to position himself as the leader the Empire needed. Through a combination of political maneuvering and direct military action, including an attack on his rival Kresh, Sado claimed the title of Dark Lord. But Sado's reign would prove disastrous in ways that validated all of Ragnos' warnings. His decision to launch a preemptive invasion of Republic space known as the Great Hyperspace War ended in catastrophic defeat. The Republic's Jedi and military forces, once they understood the threat, proved more than capable of defending their territory. Sado's strategic use of Sith sorcery and illusions was eventually countered, and his forces were driven back. When he retreated to Sith space, he found that Kresh had survived their earlier battle and seized control of the homeworlds. The resulting chaos saw the Sith fighting each other, even as Republic forces pursued them into their own territory. The empire that Ragnos had built, the civilization that had known over a century of prosperity and stability, collapsed in a matter of months. The Republic military systematically destroyed Sith strongholds across multiple worlds. Korriban itself was attacked, its academies and temples devastated. The Valley of the Dark Lords was bombarded, though Ragnos' tomb, protected by dark side barriers and its location deep within the valley, survived largely intact. The native Sith species, already rare due to generations of interbreeding, were nearly wiped out in the Republic assault. The great libraries and repositories of Sith knowledge were destroyed or scattered. Thousands of years of accumulated wisdom artifacts, and history were lost in the space of a few brutal campaigns. By the time the Republic forces withdrew, believing they had eliminated the Sith threat completely, the empire that had flourished under Ragnos was effectively destroyed. Yet, even in this catastrophic defeat, Ragnos' influence persisted. His tomb remained on Korriban, a monument to the greatest era of Sith civilization and a repository of dark side power that would draw Force sensitives for millennia to come. And his spirit, preserved through the rituals he had conducted before death, remained bound to that tomb, capable of manifesting and interacting with those who sought him out. Over the centuries and millennia that followed the fall of the Sith Empire, Ragnos' spirit would appear multiple times to individuals who found their way to his tomb. These manifestations were not mere ghosts, but conscious interactions, with Ragnos' preserved consciousness able to communicate with and even influence the living. The exact nature of this existence remains a subject of debate among those who study the Force. Was it truly Ragnos' consciousness, preserved intact through dark side techniques? Or was it some kind of Force echo, a recording of his personality and knowledge that could interact in limited ways? The evidence suggests it was genuine consciousness, as Ragnos demonstrated awareness of events that occurred long after his death and ability to engage in complex reasoning and manipulation. One of the most significant of these later interactions occurred roughly 1,500 years after Ragnos' death, during the period when a hidden Sith Empire ruled by the immortal Darth Vitiate was rebuilding in the unknown regions. A powerful Sith Lord named Teneb Kale, who would later become known as Darth Thanaton, sought out Ragnos' tomb in search of dark side knowledge and power. Ragnos' spirit manifested to him, testing the younger Sith Lord's worthiness through challenges and trials. The spirit proved to be as demanding and manipulative in death as Ragnos had been in life. He did not simply grant power to those who sought him, but instead tested them, ensuring that only the worthy received his knowledge. Those who passed his tests gained not just information about ancient Sith techniques, but also his blessing, a form of dark side empowerment that marked them as students of the greatest Dark Lord of the ancient empire. Those who failed his tests often died within his tomb, their life force consumed to sustain the dark side energies that preserved his consciousness. Through these interactions with future generations, Ragnos continued to influence Sith philosophy and practice long after the empire he ruled had fallen. The techniques he had developed, the strategies he had employed, and the wisdom he had accumulated were passed down through his spirit to worthy students. In this way, his legacy persisted even as the specific civilization he had built disappeared into history. Ragnos' tomb itself became a place of pilgrimage for Sith throughout the ages. Even after the fall of the original empire, Korriban continued to draw dark side users who sought power and knowledge. The Valley of the Dark Lords, where Ragnos' monument stood among those of other ancient rulers, became a proving ground where Sith tested themselves against the spirits and dark side energies left behind by these legendary figures. To meditate at Ragnos' tomb, to face his spirit and survive, became a rite of passage for ambitious Sith Lords. The architecture of his tomb influenced Sith building practices for millennia. Its design, combining functionality with symbolic power, became a template that later Sith Lords emulated when constructing their own monuments. The integration of dark side rituals into the structure itself, making the building not just a passive monument, but an active locus of force power, was studied and copied by generations of Sith architects and alchemists. Beyond the physical legacy of his tomb, Ragnos' approach to governance became a subject of study for thoughtful Sith throughout history. The way he had maintained power for over a century, balancing strength with intelligence, offering opportunities to ambitious subordinates while maintaining absolute authority, managing the naturally fractious Sith nature to create stability and prosperity, all of this became case studies in how to rule effectively. Various Sith lords over the millennia attempted to replicate his success with varying degrees of effectiveness. The Dark Lord Darth Bane, who lived roughly 1,000 years after Ragnos and who would establish the rule of two that guided the Sith for the next millennium, studied records of Ragnos' reign extensively. Bane understood that the Sith's greatest weakness was their tendency toward self-destructive internal conflict, the same issue that had destroyed the Empire after Ragnos' death. His solution, limiting the Sith to only two at a time, was dramatically different from Ragnos' approach of managing large numbers of ambitious Sith lords. Yet both strategies aimed at the same problem: how to preserve Sith power across generations without internal conflict destroying it. Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord who would eventually achieve the goal of destroying the Jedi Order and ruling the galaxy, also studied Ragnos' example. Sidious's own rise to power, his careful manipulation of events over decades, his skill at appearing weaker than he truly was while positioning himself for ultimate victory, all showed influence from Ragnos' methods. The way Sidious managed the transition from Republic to Empire, maintaining public order while fundamentally transforming the government, echoed Ragnos' skill at maintaining stability while wielding absolute power. Artifacts associated with Ragnos became legendary among dark side users. His lightsaber, scepter, and various personal items were scattered or hidden after the fall of his empire, becoming objects of obsessive quests for those seeking to claim a piece of his power. The discovery of even minor artifacts from his reign could grant significant dark side energy to their possessors, as these items had been infused with his power during his lifetime and continued to resonate with the Force centuries or millennia later. One particular artifact, the scepter of Marka Ragnos, would play a significant role in events thousands of years after his death. This ornate staff, which Ragnos had wielded as a symbol of his authority, contained tremendous dark side energy. In the era of Luke Skywalker's new Jedi Order, a fallen Jedi named Tavian Axmis would locate this scepter and use it to drain Force energy from multiple locations throughout the galaxy. Her plan was to resurrect Ragnos fully, bringing his spirit completely back into the physical world where he could lead the Sith once more. The attempt came very close to succeeding. Tavian used the scepter to gather immense amounts of Force energy, conducting a ritual at Ragnos' tomb that began to pull his spirit back into corporeal form. For a brief time, Marka Ragnos walked the galaxy again, not as a ghost, but as a physical being, albeit one sustained by dark side energy rather than true biological life. The resurrected Dark Lord immediately demonstrated the power and skill that had made him legendary, overwhelming Jedi opponents with combinations of lightsaber mastery and Sith sorcery that few living Force users could match. However, the resurrection was ultimately incomplete and unstable. The Jedi Jaden Korr confronted the revived Ragnos and, in a difficult battle, managed to disrupt the ritual sustaining his physical form. Ragnos' spirit was forced back into his tomb, his brief return to the physical world ending in failure. Yet even this failed resurrection demonstrated the enduring power of his legacy. Over 4,000 years after his death, Marka Ragnos remained a figure of such significance that the attempt to bring him back could be considered a credible threat to galactic peace. The philosophy Ragnos developed during his life continued to be debated among those who studied the dark side. His belief that Sith strength could be channeled productively, that ambition could build rather than merely destroy, stood in contrast to the purely destructive impulses often associated with the dark side. Critics argued that this approach diluted the pure power of the dark side, that compassion and cooperation were weaknesses regardless of their strategic value. Supporters countered that Ragnos had proven through his century-long reign that intelligence and strategy multiplied strength rather than diminishing it. This philosophical debate reflected broader questions about the nature of the dark side itself. Was it purely destructive, as traditional Jedi teaching suggested, capable only of tearing down rather than building? Or could it be wielded constructively by those with sufficient wisdom and control? Ragnos' reign suggested the latter, demonstrating that a civilization built on dark side principles could achieve genuine prosperity and cultural achievement, not merely short-term power gained through violence and chaos. Yet the ultimate failure of his empire after his death provided ammunition for the opposing view. Perhaps the Golden Age had been an aberration, dependent entirely on Ragnos' personal power and wisdom, and the Empire's collapse into self-destructive chaos once he was gone proved that dark-side civilizations were inherently unstable. The rapid destruction of everything he had built suggested that his achievements, however impressive, had been built on a foundation that could not survive without his constant management. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Ragnos proved that the dark side could be wielded with intelligence and strategy to create lasting achievements. His empire's prosperity and his own longevity demonstrated that patience and planning could triumph over short-sighted aggression. But he also failed to create a system that could survive his death, suggesting that personal power, however great, was insufficient to ensure lasting change without institutions and succession mechanisms that could preserve core values across generations. For students of history and the Force, Marka Ragnos represents a fascinating case study in the possibilities and limitations of dark-side governance. His successes were undeniable. He united a fractured empire, maintained peace and prosperity for over a century, expanded Sith territory and influence significantly, and left a cultural legacy that persisted for millennia. These achievements mark him as arguably the most successful Dark Lord in Sith history, certainly the one who maintained power for the longest period while actually governing effectively. Yet his failures were equally significant. He could not prevent the succession crisis that destroyed his empire. He could not create institutions strong enough to preserve his approach to governance without him. He could not or would not reform Sith culture sufficiently to eliminate the self-destructive tendencies that had always plagued dark-side civilizations. In the end, the very ambition and competitiveness that he had channeled so successfully during his life tore apart everything he had built, once his controlling influence was removed. The lasting influence of Marka Ragnos on galactic history cannot be overstated. His tactical and strategic innovations were studied by military commanders throughout the ages. His approach to governance influenced political philosophers considering questions of authority and power. His mastery of the dark side established benchmarks that future Sith Lords measured themselves against. His tomb remained a significant location for dark side activity for thousands of years, drawing Force sensitives who sought his knowledge and power. Even in the era of the Galactic Empire under Darth Sidious, when the Sith had transformed into something very different from the civilization Ragnos had ruled, his name remained known among those who studied Sith history. Imperial Inquisitors, dark side adepts who served Sidious and Vader, were aware of Ragnos and studied records of his techniques. The Emperor himself, with his obsessive interest in Sith history and artifacts, certainly knew of Ragnos and may have attempted to contact his spirit or acquire his artifacts, though records of any such attempts are fragmentary at best. In the century following the Battle of Yavin, as various Force-using groups emerged in the wake of the Empire's fall, knowledge of ancient Sith Lords like Ragnos experienced a revival. Luke Skywalker's new Jedi Order, despite its focus on the light side, recognized the importance of understanding dark side history to combat dark side threats. Students at Skywalker's Academy studied the tactics and strategies of ancient Sith, including Ragnos, learning how they had achieved their successes and where they had failed, using this knowledge to better defend against future dark side threats. The failed attempt to resurrect Ragnos during this period prompted extensive research into his life and reign. Scholars and historians, both Force-sensitive and not, compiled accounts from various sources to create more complete pictures of who he had been and what he had accomplished. These later studies, benefiting from archaeological discoveries on Korriban and other former Sith worlds, revealed new details about the Golden Age and its architect. Each new discovery added to the understanding of this pivotal figure in galactic history. For those seeking to understand the eternal struggle between light and dark, between Jedi and Sith, Marka Ragnos offers crucial insights. He demonstrated that the dark side, while often associated with chaos and destruction, could be wielded with discipline and long-term vision. He showed that Sith, while driven by ambition and selfishness, could cooperate and build lasting institutions when properly motivated and managed. He proved that raw power, while important, was insufficient for greatness without intelligence, strategy, and wisdom to guide its application. Yet, he also illustrated the ultimate limitations of dark side power. His inability to create a stable succession, to build institutions that could preserve his approach beyond his personal lifetime, revealed that even the greatest Dark Lord could not entirely overcome the self-destructive tendencies inherent in dark side philosophy. The very ambition that drove Sith to achieve greatness also made them unable to subordinate themselves to systems and principles larger than individual power. This fundamental contradiction would plague the Sith throughout their history, from the ancient empire through to the final defeat of Darth Sidious millennia later. As we conclude this comprehensive history of Marka Ragnos, we must acknowledge that in many ways his story is the story of the Sith themselves. His rise from obscurity to absolute power, his century of unprecedented success, and the ultimate failure of his system to survive his death all mirror the the larger pattern of Sith history. Periods of strength and achievement alternating with self-destructive conflict and defeat. Brilliance in tactics and strategy undermined by deeper philosophical problems that remained unsolved. Power accumulated and then squandered over and over throughout the millennia. Yet Ragnos also represents something more hopeful, at least from a Sith perspective. He proved that the dark side's potential extended beyond mere destruction, that ambition and strength could build as well as tear down. He demonstrated that patient intelligence could achieve more than aggressive impatience, that the Sith did not have to be constantly at each other's throats, but could work together toward common goals. These lessons, while ultimately not sufficient to prevent the Empire's fall, offered a template that future Sith could learn from if they had the wisdom to do so. 4,000 years after his death, 5,000 years after he first claimed the throne of Dark Lord, the legacy of Marka Ragnos continues to echo through the galaxy. His tomb stands still in the Valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban, a monument to the greatest age of the ancient Sith Empire. His spirit, preserved through dark side rituals and sustained by the continuing power of his legend, remains capable of manifesting to those who seek him. His tactical innovations, philosophical insights, and mastery of the dark side continue to be studied by those interested in the nature of power and the Force. In the grand scope of galactic history, Marka Ragnos stands as a towering figure, a Dark Lord who achieved heights of power and success that perhaps no other Sith ever matched. His reign of over 100 years, his expansion of the Sith Empire to unprecedented size and prosperity, his mastery of every aspect of Sith skill from combat to sorcery to political manipulation, all mark him as one of the most formidable individuals ever to wield the dark side. That his achievements ultimately prove temporary does not diminish their significance, but rather places them in the context of the eternal struggle between light and darkness that has defined galactic civilization. For those who fall asleep to stories of the Sith, who find comfort in the deep lore of Star Wars, the tale of Marka Ragnos offers something truly special. It is a story of ambition realized, of power wielded wisely, of intelligence triumphing over brute force. It is also a cautionary tale about the limits of even the greatest power, about the inability of individuals, however brilliant, to permanently reshape cultures and civilizations whose fundamental nature resists change. It is, in short, a complete exploration of what it meant to be Sith at the height of their ancient power. The history of Marka Ragnos, from his birth in the fractured Sith Empire through his rise to power, his century-long golden age, his death and transformation into a Force spirit, and his continuing influence on galactic events thousands of years later, represents a definitive study of Sith leadership at its most successful. His story offers lessons for those who study power, cautionary tales for those who seek to rule, and fascinating insights into the nature of the dark side and those who wield it. Long after the last physical remnant of his empire has crumbled to dust, the memory and influence of Marka Ragnos endures, a lasting testament to one Dark Lord who came closer than any other to solving the eternal problems of Sith civilization. If you've enjoyed this deep exploration into the life and legacy of Marka Ragnos, the greatest Dark Lord of the ancient Sith Empire, please consider subscribing to the channel for more comprehensive dives into Star Wars lore. Hit that like button if you found this journey through the golden age of the Sith fascinating, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Ragnos' achievements and failures. What do you think? Could his approach to governance have worked long-term if his successors had been wiser? Or was the Sith Empire always doomed to destroy itself? Share your perspectives, and may the Force, in whatever form you prefer, be with you.